So with that, I'm going to now invite Mr. Mohit Rampal from Ramognee Technologies. He's the founder and CEO to talk to us about disrupting application architecture. Welcome, Mr. Rampal. Over to you.
Hi, Samriddhi. Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for joining us at this late lunch hour on disrupting application architecture. Just to give a brief background about the organization, I'll quickly share my presentation so that we are on the same page, right? So when we talk about a disrupting application architecture, we're talking about how applications are disrupting, the way the architecture has changed in the last couple of decades, right? So if you go back to the early stages of application and now going forward in the next stage is what we're going to be spending some time about.
Just Mr. Rampal, your presentation is now live, just to let you know. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Right. Now, just to share with you about the organization, we pronounce ourselves as Ramognee Technologies, and we were founded in 2012. And the aim of the organization was to look at making security simple. That's one of our taglines or punchlines. And everywhere we talk across to organizations, and we share with them that our punchline is making security simple. They actually look into it and ask us, why did we pick up this particular punchline or particular tagline? Now, I spent around 3+ decades in the security industry, right from 1990s till now, and we've grown up across different segments. I've worked across on different elements of security. Now, every time a security professional would go down to a CIO or a CISO, right, they would talk so much of technical jargon that the poor CIO or CISO or even the other people in the industry would get lost out in terms of technology. So we decided to create an organization based on this aspect of creating or making security simple. Now, what do we talk about? Our simple aim is to make as easy as possible for security to be absorbed by organizations. Just to give you an idea about what we started off in commercial activity in 2018, and year on year we have been growing up across. And in the past 2.5 years, we've added close to around 25+ people into our team. So we've grown during the COVID times in terms because the technologies and solutions we are partnering with, or the technologies we have created in India, are actually helping us to move across the globe. Just to come to the topic, what is disruption? As you understand, this disruption is the act or the process of disrupting something, right? Or you're trying to break the normal course of action or continuity in any sum of the processes. Now, what do we mean by these disruption activities? Now, if you look at the application architecture in the past couple of years, I would say in the last couple of decades, a lot of things have changed in terms. That means that you were looking at a typical LAN or a WAN architecture and you've moved on to the cloud, right? Now, this is slow. The disruption has been very slow. If you look at I would say the cloud architecture, early in 2010, the cloud architecture started taking shape and taking the physical presence and being one of the disruptive application architecture, the way it has to be deployed. Slow, steady, but incremental. We're also looking at incremental, but disruption is slow, right? We're also looking at the secure cloud environments. Now we're talking about cloud security. We're talking about how do I secure the cloud? We were used to securing our native infrastructures, the WAN on the LANs, but now we're talking about securing the cloud infrastructure, right? This was a force to look into in terms of the way the market has been moving. We also look at what are the applications. We look at application architecture. What do we mean by the application architecture? We look at all this software and the hardware components and the interactions between the software and the hardware, right? I still do call the firmware inside a device as an application, right? Because for me, that's a software which has been written to communicate with the various other elements within the hardware itself, right? Now, all these contribute to the application architecture. Now, what do we mean by disruption, right? Out here, we're talking about disruptive application architecture. We're talking about new stacks. We're talking about new creations of new stacks and new technologies, right? We're talking about Internet of Things, which is again one of the disruptive technologies, right? We're talking about cognitive computing. We're talking about enterprise mobility. These have been changing the entire landscape, right? Connected cars. Who could think about connected cars in early 2005 and 6 and 7? We thought it's like a Star Trek movie, which is coming into reality. As you move forward, you're going to see a lot of more disruptive technologies coming across. Now, what do we mean by this word application architecture disruption? Now, the traditional ways, when we were talking about the old technologies, right, smartphones, etc., were the first one to move in. The technologies have drastically changed in the last couple of years. Now, what do we mean by changing? By changing here, we mean that the traditional technology was a client-server architecture, right? You have the typical old ways of writing your program on, let's say, Fortran or COBOL, etc. They've moved. things like AI, where we're not talking about artificial intelligence, when we're talking about in late 90s, or not late 90s, early 90s or late 80s. We were talking about softwares like Prolog and Lisp. And now what do we hear about? Now we hear about technologies like Python, which is different AI tools like Panda and NumPy, etc. So these are all changing the way or disrupting the way the application architecture has been created right now. Now, when you combine all of these, we are looking at new technologies. Now, I was just talking to, I think around 4 years ago, my daughter shifted to the US for her higher studies, right? In the first 3 months, she actually went and bought across a 3D printer. And, it was like something different. So you could see technology is actually disruptive the way things are moving. You're having a 3D printer wherein you're creating different modules across, right? Now, these all are typical disruptive application architectures. Some of the technologies we are talking about, friends, there are lots of technologies. You've got I would say, self-driven, or let's say computer-driven cars, but we're talking about more technologies which are coming in place, right? Now, all of them are what? If you talk to organizations, the way we've been speaking across to CIOs and CISOs across the globe, what I realized is that typically the digitization has moved enormously, right? Organizations are moving to a paperless office. And the past 2 years, since February, or I would say January 2020, right? The COVID has changed the scenario with the way we have been interacting, or the way we've been working, or the way we've been communicating, right? All of this has actually resulted in a new architecture, or I would say the new way to deliver an application. Now, this entire digitization and automation process has changed, right? Now, we are also moving in towards automation. We are also looking at APIs, or application program interface, or traditional ways. I would say, I'm talking about late 90s or early 90s, I would say you had to communicate or connect your desktop to a printer. You would have a driver, right? A driver to talk to that particular dot matrix, or a laser printer, etc. So those have changed into APIs. You've got more flexible APIs. Again, a couple of them. You've got 4 to 5 types of APIs. You've got a REST, you've got a JSON RPC, you've got a SOAP, and you've got an XML RPC. And of course, now we are also seeing GraphQL as coming as one of the languages, right? Now, the entire technology has changed. From a waterfall, we're looking at Scrum and Agile. It's changed the way the organizations are now creating applications, or consuming applications, or delivering. They've changed in the entire scenario. We're looking at data management. What do we mean by data management? How are we managing the data? I think in one of the earliest sessions, a plenary session where Dr. Behal was talking about, we were talking about ransomware, and I think Matan Babu and a gentleman Bob, they were talking about how data management is important going forward, looking at the aspects of the quantum of ransomware attacks which are taking place. So organizations need to look at different or better methods of data management, so that the data is not compromised. When you were working prior to COVID, it was easy because all your employees, or all the employees, were coming into the office. And when they were coming into the office, we were looking at them, looking at their data, right? Or looking at whatever development work they were doing. So we had this sense of security that, hey, you know what? My code or my intellectual property as an organization is safe. Now that's changed. That has changed drastically in the last 2.5 years. What's happened is work from home is a culture. We don't know how long it's going to stay. But yes, organizations are looking at digitization, or looking at new technologies to be able to adopt or adapt to these technologies. Why? Because we want to ensure that all our customer touch points, or all our intellectual property is safe and safeguarded. The other major challenge which organizations are facing is digital twins. What we mean by digital twins is, before I roll out a network, or I roll out an application, or roll out any of my solutions into my corporate world, I would like to ensure that I'm able to test and look into them and figure out how do I prepare them in terms of, I would say, the architecture layout, or the configurations, etc. It's important. I'm not talking about typically that, I need to have something. So it's important now organizations are realizing that, yes, I do need a digital twin. Now, by meaning as a digital twin, we are looking at how do I get a digital twin in place? How do I make that happen? How do I do that in terms? Because you can't create, or you can't acquire infrastructure. So people are moving towards the cloud, looking at cloud infrastructure where they're creating digital twins. One is a dev server, then you have got a UAT server, and then you got a production server. So they're creating multiple architectures in that area. The other important aspect which I'm talking about is the artificial intelligence, right? AI has taken over drastically in a number of ways, right? You had AI tools to, forecast a business method, right? But now we are also using AI for cybersecurity. I know a lot of organizations which have popped up, which were in AI, which were looking at more of business analytics, right? Now they're moving towards using of AI for cybersecurity. That's another important aspect we feel is happening across the globe. So AI is there to stay. One important point you have to understand is, on the first point when I mentioned about automation and APIs, right? Now, the entire transition has happened across with the Scrum and Agile technologies is that, hey, you know what? I just want to have a simple API which communicates, or it should be communicating to my backend from my front end, because I don't wish to expose too much of data. But the entire architecture has changed towards an API-centric architecture. If you look into the industry right now, presently, you'll find that the likes, all the big wigs, right? They have something called an API gateway where they are helping you manage your APIs, right? The quantum of APIs with IoTs and the new technology, right? Wherein you're saying, I want to deliver something tomorrow, right? You no longer rewrite a code. You actually go onto the API. You go and look at let's assume that you're putting up an application for roads, for let's say discovering roads or for driving, right? You no longer create a map. You just go to places like Google or Mapbox, etc., or even like local Indian players, and then you pick up their APIs wherein you can get information for your mobile app or for your desktop app. Now, all these are API-centric architectures which are taking place. Finally, which is not and the last on this technology we're talking about is how are we moving towards the agile or just-in-time architecture. So transition has started happening towards more of an agile method, right? The organizations are shifting over from dev to DevOps, right, and to DevSecOps. We as an organization, we actually push organizations to move to a DevSecOps, right? As traditionally, internally, as a creator of a product, right, we are following DevSecOps because we've shifted security to complete left in our organization. That means every module which is created within the organization first goes through the entire security testing too, not just the functional testing, before it gets into the the QA or the UAT testing environment. We want to figure out or fix up the vulnerabilities at an early stage rather than looking into it. Second, as an organization, our own history or our own story is we are API centric. We've created two technologies, but they are both API centric. Everything is an API. So we spend the least amount of time to recreate a front end or a back end. So we made them so agile or I would say independent that any changes in anything in the middleware or the front end or the back end, there is no impact on the entire application. We can do that pretty quickly. We're not only just talking about DevSecOps, we are actually practicing DevSecOps. And then last, of course, just to give you an idea about a digital twin, you should read this book, on digital twins, which was anticipated by David Gelenters, right, called The Mirror Worlds, right? That talks about a little bit about digital twins, right? We talk about digital twins in technology. And then if you're looking at AI, again, like I was sharing, we have come across at least a dozen plus organizations in the last 2 or 3 days, where they're using AI not only to look at the cyber incident, but they're also looking at using AI and writing their machine learning models to be able to forecast when could they feel or when they could see a next attack happening, based on the circumstances. Now, what's happened in the digitization world right now? What's happening is we are no longer in C's, right? I remember the Microsoft gentleman talking about, the application architecture, and then when you're talking about the attack surface, the attack surface is no longer limited. Now the attack surface with this digitization has increased, right? It's no longer the front end and the C's, right? We have attacks happening on the back end. We have attacks with, hackers do a recon on your entire application or your entire activity, right? So it's no longer looking at the front end. They do a recon on the map. They do a recon on the back end process. They do a recon on your middleware, right? So everything is possible to be getting compromised or attacked. Then what we're looking at is what? The new dependencies. It's not just the digitization, right? The application program interface has also increased or has set up a new standard for organizations. So we've been speaking across to a number of organizations domestically as well as internationally, where they've been sensing and sharing with us, we have a problem. We have a gateway. We have an API gateway, but there is no way we are able to look into or, manage the security of our APIs consumed. And when we ask them what type of APIs are they consuming, 90% of the people we spoke to are talking about utilization of a REST or a RESTful API. A very small population, I would say 3 to 4% is using SOAP, and the remaining are distributed between, another 2% or 3% is distributed within JSON RPC and XML RPC. So typically REST is there to stay. REST APIs are changing the landscape of security completely. Organizations are feeling the hit of RESTful API compromise. If you look at that, we'll just talk about it. Now, this is a new dependency on the risk, right? There have been now, it's like API is the gateway to your entire organization. Even as we speak in this 15 minutes of a presentation, I'm sure if you go back and look at all the API gateways, you'll find that thousands and thousands of APIs have been consumed in the last 15 minutes across just maybe 2 or 3 gateways. But if you look at the entire list of gateways, you'll find maybe 1 million or plus APIs are being consumed at every minute, every second we talk about it, right? Those APIs are the gateways to organizations' applications, or the gateways to your intellectual property or to the organization's property. Now, APIs are easy to deploy, right? They're actually emerged as one of the most easiest ways to get into a system. But of course, they're also the most attractive way for hackers to compromise the system. Just to give you a simple a story, which is internally we have seen it, and whenever we are talking to our clients and we're talking to people in the organizations or CIOs, when we ask them, does your security team understand what APIs are? The answer is yes, they do, but they don't understand that completely. That's what got us thinking into the area of that. APIs, yes, is a clear area where organizations need some assistance on, right? Just to give you a market overview, what's happening in the market, right? You look at the Empower points out that the number of API vulnerabilities have increased by over 154% in the last 4 years, right, till 2018. I'm talking about the past. Now let's look at what's happening, right? Now the API testing market is to grow to around 2.5 billion by 2027. We've already seen a lot of traction. We have seen a lot of organizations. We've seen like people like Salt, etc. They're talking about APIs, right? But they're literally on a cloud-based solution where they try to offer, and most of the backend happens on, let's say, for example, is on physical people actually testing those APIs, right? There's not much of automation there, right? Then we look at Gartner. They predict that by 2022, that is next year, the number of API attacks is going to be drastically increasing, right? There are going to be more than a few 100,000 APIs getting compromised, right? Now, if you look at IM Visions, right, their survey shows that 90% of CIOs, the major worry for CIOs is, I need to secure my APIs, right? And it also shows that enterprises are consuming more and more of APIs as compared to in the past. And last but not the least, just to share with you, in August 2021 itself, we had a couple of breaches which were on API which got reported. One of them was, I think, on IBM and a couple of other ones. Now, what are the drivers in APIs? Why do we need to talk about API security, right? Why did I take up this topic about API security? One of the major reasons is modern applications, if you look at it, they consume a lot of APIs presently. Just to give an idea, we have a product which we created, a completely different product, right? We're consuming more than around 65 plus APIs into our entire product, because for everything, we've actually made it so modular that we are writing an API for every aspect we can do, so that it saves the time for deployment, it saves the time for, you would say, maintenance, etc. It's easy, it's more comfortable, right? It's more unique, right? And then what happens right now is, of course, we are increasing the attack surface, so we need to safeguard those. Visibility of APIs. Most of the organizations, when we speak to, just to give an example, we were talking to one of the largest top banks in the country, and I would say insurance company. The major challenge they faced was always is that, the developers give us a list of APIs which are being consumed within the application. But by the time we have tested them, and by the time the product goes into production, they come at the last minute and say, there's a new version, we need to update this because of XYZ reasons. That's the time most of the APIs get slipped off across, right? So the developers or the security team hardly gets a time to figure out what are the APIs being consumed. Because presently there are no technologies in the industry which help you to discover all the list of APIs. You may discover the endpoints, right? But you've got to classify or identify which of these endpoints you have are web URLs and which of them are REST or SOAP or JSON RPC or XML RPC or a GraphQL. So it's important to get a complete 100% visibility of the APIs being consumed within your application. Third, if you look at regulatory compliances and laws, yes, of course, GDPR compliance very clearly indicates that you can't have a PII information going. And since your modern applications do consume APIs, a lot of PII information goes through. Just to give you an idea, a quarter or 2 quarters ago, there was some news about a certain Indian organization where or I would say global organization, where the data got leaked out. And what was the data? That was the PII information of the bank, I would say the security numbers, etc., getting leaked out. Now, that's important because now there are laws. Again, in the morning, in a Dr. Bell's session in the morning in plenary, they were talking about ransomware, and they're saying, yes, regulatory compliances are driving across the world, where they're saying that, yes, you've got to keep, the developer needs to keep, or the application holder needs to keep. So if it's a bank, they need to secure it, otherwise they're going to get penalized, right? Now, even in India, I remember reading an article somewhere earlier this last month, I believe, which was an article published, which was, I think, a notification public by by the Reserve Bank of India, which also very clearly in a fine line mentioned, you got to take care of the APIs being consumed within your application. So that got us thinking, yes, APIs are there, compliances are there. The quantum of cyber attacks, we just got one of our research associates within the organization just to look at the NVD and a couple of other databases to see how many vulnerabilities have got reported in the last, let's say, 2 years on APIs. And we were actually taken aback with the quantum of vulnerabilities reported onto NVD. We were expecting just maybe a few or maybe a dozen, but the number was far larger. So we try to create a repository wherein we can look into the APIs and how API vulnerabilities are working on. And last, which is very, very important, most of the organizations we've spoken to across the globe, they confuse the OWASP 2017 and 21 with OWASP 2019, which talks about API security. They're completely different. So OWASP in 2019 took out the OWASP 2000 API security, keeping in mind that they wanted to differentiate APIs versus web applications. Of course, APIs are a part of the web application, but looking at addressing the security for an API is entirely much more different as compared to looking at the security of a web application. So we're not looking at testing of the web application for typical vulnerabilities. For example, you don't have BOLA, which is A1 in OWASP 2019 appearing in 2017 or 21, because that's a broken object level authorization, which does not exist for a web application. So traditional methods of testing out using the traditional tools which are there in the industry for checking out your security for an API does not suffice or help you out to look at the security for an API, because those are tools defined or created for web applications. Last, API security. And every time, just to share with you, it's a live example we given within our team also, is most of the security professionals we speak about, and every time we interview candidates for our products or product creation, we ask them about the types of APIs, right? Most of them just understand what is a REST API. They say REST or a SOAP, right? Some of them even say Google APIs and Facebook APIs, right? But we're talking about the basic construction, right? So expecting a security professional to be hands-on to understand how a REST API works is going to be difficult, right? It's very, very time consuming. It's not that something it's like looking into it and figuring out it's a URL or a web API or it's a SOAP API or a REST API. It takes time. You need to have a lot of experience in understanding the major differences between a REST and a SOAP, right? Or a REST and a web URL. Second, it's consuming. You can't just write 1 or 2 test cases and figure it out, right? For example, in BOLA, you got to look at the object level authorization. You've got to identify the object within an API, right? Or if you take, let's say, A2, which is where you have authorization, you've got to understand the minor difference between the authorization and authentication. You got to look into the API to figure out how you can exploit it, right? So security teams at times, because of time consumption or time, miss out or skip out here. Third, most of the developers look at Postman, etc., or you look at the Swagger format and they say, you know what, my API is constructed as per it. When we examined a couple of APIs, when we examined physically APIs created by organizations across as a sample, we realized that most of the organizations are not following a best practice as commented for a REST API. We realized that they were not even looking at the entire flow or documentation or a lot of things, or rate limiting within their applications were not being constructed, right? So we realized that they are issues beyond not just security testing, but also best practices, which could lead to a functional issue, could lead to a security issue. So we actually spent time to understand this area. And last but not the least, we have traditional systems. When you're talking about traditional WAFs, they do some piece of job for you, but they actually do not protect, or they will not secure your API, will not test your API, right? For any zero-day or a vulnerability attack, right? They're there to act like a application firewall. They will protect something from happening if the signature is available. But it's important that you should not be just depending on the traditional defenses. You got to implement testing of every single API being consumed within an organization, looking at the OWASP 2019 to be able to forecast. Just to give a quick technology checklist, right? Whenever you're going to be selecting any technology for your API security, you got to look into a couple of things. One is, the most important thing is ease of use, right? We were talking to one of the global chief, I would say, product officers of one of the largest companies I've been associated with personally. If you're having a product, right, it's the ease of use. If you make it very complicated, it first goes against your tagline, making security simple. So you got to make it simple. You got to make it as least number of clicks. I spent a couple of years in a mobile WAS industry, and I realized what he meant by that, because click to action has to be as least as possible, right? So just to give an example, if your click to action to do a particular activity is around 3 or 4 or 5 clicks, the user who's using your technology is already averse and saying it's a pretty complicated technology. So one of the important things while selecting anything to do with application disruption, or typically on the API side, look at the ease of use. 2 is, we realized that most of the technologies we were talking or we were examining with regard to API checking, right, API testing, some of them or most of them they were not clientless. You required to download a client. One of our very large customers, the first point he told us was, hey, you know what, Mohit, whenever you're looking at an application or you're going to get us or introduced to an application, please look into the fact that it's clientless. And my question to them was, why? He says, every time you put a client on a machine, we are already struggling to have an 8 GB or a 16 GB of RAM with our developers. The client takes away a certain amount of memory and storage, right? And that becomes very, very difficult because the systems go slow and the productivity goes down. So you've got to look at technologies which are clientless, right? The other important aspect when you're looking at this disruptive technology of APIs, you've got to have a technology which helps you to discover all the APIs being consumed in your project. It's a very important aspect. You should also be allowed to add APIs. I'm not saying that the tools or technology in the industry all will discover every single thing. But yes, of course, they're going to miss out a couple of things. So you should have the privilege, or your development team or your security team should have the access to be adding an API. You should also have access to adding your own test case, because most of the OEMs will never tell you exactly what are the test cases they have embedded inside the system. So it's always important to also import your own test cases. So this is something which is important when you're looking at a technology. The next important thing is, it should not look at OWASP 2017 or 21. It should be focused on OWASP API 2019. It should also not only look at that, but also provide you the remediation techniques. What are the remediations or best ways to protect, right? Not only for the vulnerabilities, but also for the best practices. For example, your development team may not be following a best practice. It should help you to follow a best practice, tell you exactly what you need to do. And the remediations should be actually hands-on or reflecting to something on the CWE score or the NVD database or a MITRE database, right? But also tell you suggestions from the industry side. That you are looking at a complete CI/CD integration. So it's important as an organization, when you're looking into it, have a simple checklist before you decide to implement API security into your networks. Just a quick slide on conclusion. Yes, based on whatever we have spent time in the last 18 months to 20 months, we've been talking to people. We've realized that APIs have actually changed, are a very disruptive technology, which has changed the way the application architecture has moved. This in turn has added another set, or I would say another set of your attack surface, right? The attack surface is no longer limited. It's now has a new surface, which is also looking at APIs. So you've got to look at the APIs in toto when you're looking at creating your application security posture. They've changed source of risk, because risk typically you were looking at, whatever coding the guys were doing, but you forgot to look at the APIs. This gets another risk. Why? Because the APIs are the gateway. A simple mistake by the developer in an API can actually extract the entire JSON data, entire data from your database and publish it, right? So these are risks which can get published or which can get missed out if you do not have, you don't look at APIs as security. Last, which is important point, second last I would say, is you need to look at security testing beyond web applications. You've got to look at APIs much more differently with a different viewpoint. You've got to have a dedicated team. You've got to have a team which works on looking at APIs. And last, which is important, which is in API inventory. So before you start doing, the security team or the QA team or the UAT team starts testing it out, they should have a clear-cut indication about what is the API inventory do they have. What are the list of APIs that developers are declaring, right? And then the security professionals need to interact with the application to figure out what are the other APIs which are being called across. So you've got to have this entire list or gamut of the list of APIs being consumed, right? And you should test every API for a vulnerability. It's not that you've got to leave out a certain API because you feel, I don't think so anybody's going to hack into that API. So that's a mindset which, the security team will never should utilize and say, okay, we need to test every single API being discovered within our application. So that's the last of my slides, and over to the team.